The midnight ride. Emma had always felt safe in cities, trusting the convenience of taxis to get her where she needed to go. But this night, everything would change. She had just arrived at the small, regional airport in the outskirts of the city, a city she had never been to before. Her flight had been delayed, and she'd missed the last train. The airport was nearly empty, and the overhead lights flickered in the terminal, casting strange shadows on the deserted area. She checked her watch. It was 12:15 a.m. Her hotel was about an hour away, a long journey through winding roads and dense forests, according to the clerk at the rental desk. But she hadn't rented a car. She had no intention of driving this late at night in an unfamiliar place. Fortunately, there was a taxi stand outside the terminal. She stepped out into the cool night air, the hum of the highway in the distance. The taxi stand was empty except for one cab, an older, beat-up sedan with tinted windows. A tall, thin man with a scruffy beard was standing next to it, smoking a cigarette. He looked up as Emma approached. "Need a ride, miss?" he asked in a low voice, his accent thick but not unfamiliar. "Yes, please. To the city center," Emma replied, trying to sound calm despite the unease creeping in. He opened the door for her with a creak of metal, and she slid into the back seat. The inside of the taxi smelled faintly of stale cigarettes and cheap air freshener. There was a faint buzzing sound from somewhere in the back of the car, like a faulty electrical connection. The driver got in and started the car without saying a word, only glancing at her in the rearview mirror. As they drove out of the airport, Emma tried to relax. The city lights quickly faded, and the landscape turned into dense woods and winding, poorly lit roads. Her phone was dead, and there was no sign of any other cars on the road. She felt increasingly isolated. "So, what's your name?" she asked, trying to make conversation. "Call me Greg," the driver said, his eyes never leaving the road. His voice was low, almost a growl. "Nice to meet you, Greg," Emma said, forcing a smile. "How long have you been driving?" "A while," he replied briefly. His tone was curt, and there was something unsettling about his demeanor. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and the car swerved slightly as they took a sharp curve. Emma leaned back, trying to ignore the growing discomfort in her stomach. The darkness outside seemed to stretch on forever. The buzzing sound from the back of the car grew louder, and she noticed the rearview mirror was cracked, distorting her reflection. She couldn't help but stare at it, her mind starting to race with thoughts of why everything felt wrong. Suddenly, Greg spoke again. "You're not from around here, are you?" Emma's heart skipped a beat. "No," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just visiting for work." "You should be careful at night, especially on these roads. Strange things happen out here," he said, his voice almost too calm. "People get lost, never come back." Emma swallowed hard, wondering if she had misjudged the situation. "What do you mean? Lost where?" Greg didn't answer right away. His eyes flickered to the rearview mirror, then back to the road. "There's places out here that aren't on the map," he muttered, almost as if to himself. "Once you get too far, it's easy to miss your way. Some people say they see things, strange things, figures in the woods, shadows that follow you." Emma tried to laugh it off. "I think you've been driving too long, Greg. I'm sure it's just a story." He didn't respond, and the atmosphere in the car grew colder, as if the warmth from the city was fading the further they drove. The trees outside seemed to close in on them, their skeletal branches clawing at the air. Emma checked her watch. It had been 20 minutes since they left the airport, but something felt off, as if time was stretching unnaturally. Without warning, the car's headlights flickered and then went out completely. Emma gasped as the world around her turned pitch black. The only sound was the low hum of the engine and the faint rustling of the trees. "Greg, what happened?" she asked, panic creeping into her voice. Greg didn't answer. Instead, he pulled the car over to the side of the road and sat there, motionless. Emma could hear his heavy breathing now, but there was something wrong about it, labored, almost as if he was waiting for something. The buzzing from the back of the car had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. "Greg?" she asked again, her voice trembling. "We need to fix the lights. We should call someone." Greg slowly turned to face her. His eyes were wide, but his face was emotionless. There was no trace of recognition in his gaze. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "Now you're in it, too." Emma's heart began to race. Her eyes darted around the car, searching for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. Then she heard it, soft footsteps outside the car. Slow, deliberate. She pressed her back against the seat, trying to make herself as small as possible. The footsteps grew louder, closer. There was no wind, no sound of leaves crunching beneath shoes. Just the footsteps. She could feel her breath quickening, her chest tightening. Suddenly, the passenger side door slammed open, and Emma froze. A shadow stepped into the car, its shape distorted by the dim moonlight filtering through the cracked window. It was tall, impossibly thin, with unnaturally long limbs. Its face was a dark blur, but Emma could feel its eyes on her. Cold, empty eyes. Greg didn't move. He didn't even blink. Before she could scream, the shadow leaned in closer, its breath cold against her neck. And then, in the stillness of the night, it spoke in a voice that sounded like it came from the depths of the earth. "You're lost now. There's no going back." Emma couldn't breathe. She felt her body freeze, as if it were being consumed by the darkness around her. The shadow's hand reached out and touched her shoulder, sending a wave of ice through her body. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The door slammed shut, and the lights on the taxi flickered back on, as though nothing had happened. Greg was still staring straight ahead, his face impassive. "This is where you get off," he said, his voice empty. Emma didn't think. She opened the door and ran into the woods, not caring where she went, as long as it was away from that car. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow as she ran blindly through the trees. But when she looked back, the taxi was gone. There was no sign of it, just the woods, dark and silent, and the cold breath of the night. And then, just before she lost all sense of time and place, she heard the words again, faint and distant. "You're lost now.